For countless generations, this vast continent was not empty, waiting for discovery. It was already full. It was home. Long before any European sail broke the Atlantic horizon, human stories were being written in the forests, along the rivers, and across the Great Plains. The tale we think we know starts far too late. To truly understand the birth of colonial America, we must begin millennia earlier, in the deep, ancient world that was already here. As the great ice sheets of the last age slowly retreated, they revealed a raw, new landscape. Small, resilient bands of people moved with the rhythm of the earth itself. They followed the great herds, mammoths, bison, across icy bridges and into green, unfamiliar valleys. They were hunters, gatherers, intimately tied to the seasonal gifts of the land, the ripening berries, the migrating birds, the hidden roots. Can you imagine the silence of that world, broken only by the wind, the calls of animals, and the quiet talk of families around a fire? These were the first chapters. Over centuries that stretched into millennia, these nomadic lives began to change in certain places. In regions where the sun was warm and the soil rich, a quiet revolution took root, literally. People began to notice how seeds fell, sprouted, and could be encouraged. They began to cultivate. The most important of these were three sisters: maize, beans, and squash. Planted together, they supported each other and, in turn, supported larger, more settled communities. Villages grew where camps once stood. With a more reliable harvest, society could become more complex. It was a slow, patient turning point, the foundation for everything that would come. In the lush eastern woodlands, this complexity bloomed into something astonishing. Cultures rose that transformed the very earth beneath their feet. The Adena and later the Hopewell peoples became master builders, not of stone, but of soil. They constructed enormous earthen mounds, often in the shapes of serpents, birds, and other sacred forms. These were not mere piles of dirt. They were ceremonial centers, places of burial and astronomy, monuments that reached for the sky. And these people were not isolated. Their trade networks stretched for thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the far west, all flowed along routes connecting distant peoples. A continent already hummed with exchange. Centuries later, in the fertile river valleys of what we now call the Midwest and Southeast, the Mississippian culture reached a stunning peak. Imagine a city like Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, thriving 1,000 years ago. Its center was dominated by vast, flat-topped pyramids of earth, great platforms for temples and the homes of leaders. Plazas hosted bustling markets and sacred games. At its height, it was one of the largest urban centers in the world north of Mexico. A priest or chieftain standing atop the grandest mound could look out over a metropolis of thatch roofs, plazas, and fields, all connected by trade and a shared worldview. This was no wilderness. It was a managed, sophisticated world. Far to the north, in the forests around the Great Lakes, a different model of power emerged: the Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, forged a political alliance among 5, then 6 distinct nations. Their great law of peace was a sophisticated system of balance, designed to resolve conflict through counsel and consensus rather than endless war. It was a durable, elegant structure of governance that would later impress and puzzle European newcomers. How could such a system exist, they wondered, without a king? In the arid Southwest, people built in harmony with a harsh sun. Their ancestors, the Pueblo peoples, engineered elaborate irrigation canals to channel precious water from rivers to their fields of corn. They constructed entire villages of stone and adobe, sometimes tucked high into sheer cliff faces for protection and coolness. Places like Mesa Verde were marvels of planning, communities stacked upon themselves, facing the sun, built to last. And on the far western edge, along the misty coasts of the Pacific Northwest, life was dictated by the sea's abundance. Giant cedar trees were transformed into vast plank houses and soaring totem poles. The annual salmon run was the heartbeat of the year, providing such plentiful food that societies could support artists, nobles, and elaborate ceremonial traditions without relying on agriculture. The sea was their garden. What tied all these diverse worlds together? Not a single language, or one ruler, or a common flag. It was a deep, shared history etched into the land itself. It was a web of relationships, through trade, through marriage, through diplomacy, and yes, through conflict. When the first European ships finally appeared on the eastern horizon, they were not arriving in a void. They were stepping onto a stage where epic stories had already been unfolding for thousands of years. The drama was already in its second act. Who, then, were these first Europeans to arrive? The answer might surprise you. They were not Spanish adventurers in gleaming armor, nor English settlers seeking religious freedom. The first ones came from the cold, northern edge of Europe, in sturdy wooden longships. Centuries before Columbus stirred dreams of a western route to the Indies, other seafarers from a world of fjords and sagas dared the angry North Atlantic. These were the Norse, Vikings from Scandinavia. Skilled navigators who read the stars and waves, they had already settled the remote islands of Iceland and then pushed further, to the icy shores of Greenland. From there, the most daring captains sailed westward into the unknown, chasing rumors of land. Their stories were preserved in epic tales called sagas. They spoke of a place they named Vinland, a wineland, a coast of dense forests and, tantalizingly, wild grapes. For generations, scholars wondered, was this just a legend, a sailor's fantasy? Or was it a memory of a real place, somewhere on the northeastern edge of the vast continent? The question hung in the air until the mid-20th century, when a discovery settled the debate. On the windswept northern tip of Newfoundland, in a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, archaeologists uncovered the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. The outlines of sod-walled buildings, the site of a simple forge for working iron, artifacts of Norse design, all testified to a brief, but very real, presence. Scientific dating placed this outpost right around the year 1000 AD. The sagas were not mere myth. They were history. This settlement, however, was no bustling colony. It was small, a seasonal camp for perhaps a few dozen people at most. It served as a base for exploring the new coastline, for gathering timber and other resources scarce in Greenland. Some finds, like butternuts that could not have grown in Newfoundland, hint that these Norse explorers sailed further south, probing warmer bays and inlets. They were the ultimate pioneers, linking the edges of the known world through sheer nerve and sailing skill. Yet their foothold did not last. The sagas speak of conflicts with the local peoples they called Skraelings, likely the ancestors of the Beotic or other Algonquian groups. The Norse, few in number and far from home, found themselves in a land already occupied by societies with their own rules and defenses. The combination of distance, a harsh climate, and these tensions proved too great. Within a few decades, the outpost was abandoned. The Norse withdrew back across the Atlantic, leaving behind only whispers in their stories and faint traces in the soil. For the indigenous nations of the mainland, this strange, brief encounter was likely a curious footnote, a tale of odd visitors from across the sea. It did not reshape their world. Life continued, governed by the ancient cycles of seasons, the dynamics of local alliances, and the rhythms of trade and ceremony that had existed for centuries. The true, transformative wave of European contact was still nearly 500 years away. The continent's deep history flowed on undisturbed. What changed in Europe to send that next, relentless wave? The continent itself was transforming. Kingdoms like Spain, France, and England were consolidating power, their monarchs growing stronger and hungrier. They competed fiercely for wealth and prestige. The old overland routes to the silks and spices of Asia were long, dangerous, and controlled by intermediaries. A powerful new desire took hold, to find a direct sea route to the riches of the East. This was the engine of the so-called Age of Exploration. Technology made the dream possible. Ship design evolved, creating vessels like the caravel that could brave the open ocean. Navigational tools improved, and intertwined with the hunger for gold and spices was a fierce religious zeal, a drive to spread Christianity and outflank both Muslim empires and rival Christian powers. It was this potent mix of faith, fear, and greed that propelled Christopher Columbus westward under the Spanish flag in 1492. His landfall in the Caribbean, of course, was not on the North American mainland. He believed until his dying day he had reached the outskirts of Asia. But his voyages unlocked a floodgate. They proved the Atlantic could be crossed and that there were lands and peoples to be claimed. Within decades, Spanish conquistadors and settlers fanned out, drawn by rumors of golden cities. They carved into the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and pushed north into the lands that would become Florida and the American Southwest. Almost simultaneously, other Europeans were drawn to the northern latitudes. French and Portuguese fishermen, seeking the incredibly abundant cod stocks of the Grand Banks, began working the waters off Newfoundland. They set up seasonal drying stations on shore. These quiet, practical men were the vanguard of a different kind of empire, one built not on conquest, but on trade. For the myriad indigenous nations, the arrival of these new Europeans was a universe of contradictions. It presented sudden, dizzying opportunities. Metal tools, axes, knives, needles, were far superior to stone or bone. Brightly colored cloth, glass beads, and copper kettles entered long-established trade networks, becoming symbols of status and power. Some indigenous leaders astutely used these new goods and alliances with the newcomers to gain advantage over their traditional rivals. A clever chief with access to European metal could reshape local politics. But the visitors also brought invisible passengers, far more devastating than any weapon. Diseases for which the peoples of the Americas had no immunity: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. These illnesses spread like wildfire, often racing ahead of the Europeans themselves, traveling along those ancient indigenous trade routes that connected village to village. The result was a catastrophe almost beyond comprehension. In some communities, the death toll reached 90%. Imagine a village where only 1 in 10 people survive. The elders who held the knowledge, the farmers who knew the fields, the parents, the children, gone. This demographic collapse shattered societies. It weakened political structures, left fields untended, and created spiritual despair. It also created vacuums of power, openings that European agents would soon step into, whether as allies, traders, or conquerors. The chain of cause and effect here is crucial. European states, competing with each other, sought wealth and strategic advantage. That pursuit drove men across the ocean. Their arrival introduced new tools and new alliances into a complex existing world. But it also unleashed biological and technological forces that shattered the old balances. Indigenous societies were never passive in this story. They adapted, negotiated, resisted, and fought with remarkable skill. Yet the scale of the change, especially the tidal wave of disease, created crises that no single community, no matter how resilient, could fully withstand. As the 16th century unfolded, 2 European powers moved most aggressively into the continental landmass that would become the United States, Spain and France. And they did so in utterly different ways, creating patterns that would define the continent for centuries. Long before English families dreamed of crossing the Atlantic, Spanish missions dotted the deserts of the Southwest, and French canoeists were paddling deep into the heart of the continent. Spain's gaze turned northward from its rich, conquered empires in Mexico and Peru. The lands they called La Florida and the distant interior were not seen as empty prizes, but as a vast defensive frontier. Their primary goal was to protect the treasure fleets, the annual convoy of ships laden with American silver, as they sailed from the Caribbean back to Seville. They also aimed to block any rival European power, especially France or England, from gaining a foothold from which to threaten their lifeline. This defensive impulse led to sudden, violent clashes. When French Huguenots, Protestants, established a small, shaky outpost called Fort Caroline on the Florida coast in the 1560s, Spain saw it as a direct threat. A formidable commander, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, was dispatched. He attacked and ruthlessly destroyed the French settlement. To secure the claim, he immediately founded a permanent garrison nearby. That settlement, St. Augustine, established in 1565, would become the oldest continuously inhabited European-founded city in what is now the continental United States. The message was clear. Spain would defend its claim to the entire southeastern coastline with force. For indigenous nations like the Timucua in Florida, this sudden arrival of competing Europeans was a disruptive storm. They found themselves pulled into a colonial rivalry they had not chosen, forced to navigate dangerous new alliances, trade opportunities, and the constant threat of violence. Meanwhile, Spanish expeditions probed far to the west, into the arid and semi-arid landscapes that would become New Mexico, Texas, and California. Here, Spanish strategy blended the cross and the sword. Franciscan friars, driven by a zeal to save souls, established missions near indigenous communities. Their goal was twofold: to convert people to Catholicism and to transform them into settled, tax-paying subjects of the Spanish crown, living in European-style villages, practicing European agriculture. Soldiers built presidios, or forts, nearby to project royal authority and protect these fragile religious outposts. This system created a peculiar, intense pressure cooker of colonialism. In New Mexico, they encountered the Pueblo peoples who had lived in settled, multi-story towns for centuries, with their own rich, complex spiritual traditions tied to the land and the cycles of rain. The Spanish missionary campaigns sought to dismantle this world. They banned traditional ceremonies, destroyed sacred objects called Katsina figures, and imposed Catholic rituals. Spanish officials also demanded tribute and labor through a system called encomienda, placing heavy burdens on Pueblo communities. The combination of religious suppression, forced labor, and occasional violence bred a deep, smoldering resentment. This pressure finally exploded in 1680, in the event known as the Pueblo Revolt. A remarkable leader named Pope, from the San Juan Pueblo, coordinated a secret, continent-wide alliance among the diverse Pueblo communities. In a stunningly synchronized uprising, they drove the Spanish settlers, soldiers, and friars out of the province of New Mexico entirely. For over a decade, the Spanish were gone. The Pueblo people tore down the mission churches, washed the Christian baptism from their bodies in rivers, and restored their traditional ways. The revolt did not emerge from nowhere. It was the direct result of decades of cultural assault and coercion. It proved a powerful truth. Indigenous peoples could act collectively to push back a mighty empire, at least for a time. When Spain eventually reconquered the region, they did so on somewhat different terms, forced to be more cautious and to allow a degree of religious coexistence. Spanish power was real and often brutal, but it was never absolute. It constantly had to negotiate with the powerful agencies of the peoples whose land it occupied. While Spain built its network of missions and forts in the south, a colder, greener empire was taking shape to the north. French ambitions in North America were different. They centered less on immediate extraction of gold or converting masses, and more on a single, highly profitable commodity, furs, especially beaver pelts, which were in frenzied demand in Europe for fashionable hats. From the early 1600s, French explorers, traders, and Jesuit missionaries worked their way into the continent's heart. They traveled along the St. Lawrence River, into the Great Lakes, and eventually down the Mississippi. This vast territory would be known as New France. A key figure was Samuel de Champlain, a skilled navigator and cartographer often called the father of New France. He helped establish a permanent settlement at Quebec in 1608. Champlain's survival strategy was simple: alliance. French numbers were always tiny compared to the indigenous populations. To survive, to trade, and to travel, they needed partners. Champlain deliberately forged a close alliance with the Huron-Wendat Confederacy, a powerful group in the Great Lakes region. For the French, these alliances were not charity, they were a necessity. They relied on indigenous trappers and middlemen to bring furs from the deep interior to trading posts. They depended on indigenous knowledge of the river routes, hunting grounds, and diplomatic landscapes. In return, indigenous communities received European goods, metal axes, copper kettles, wool cloth, and most significantly, firearms. The fur trade intensified existing indigenous trade networks, but it also transformed them, injecting new technologies and economic pressures into ancient rivalries. It made certain goods necessities, and it made certain alliances matters of life and death. Close behind the fur traders came the black robes, the Jesuit missionaries. They lived among indigenous communities, learned their languages with remarkable dedication, and wrote detailed reports. They sought converts not by mass decree, but through patient, often dangerous, personal persuasion. Among the Huron, they established mission villages, trying to reshape daily life and belief. These efforts were sometimes welcomed by individuals seeking new spiritual answers or access to trade goods, but were often resisted by communities as a threat to their core identity. The French approach was therefore distinct from the Spanish model of rigid control. It was a lighter, more decentralized imperial touch, built on a web of commercial and personal relationships. But it was still an empire. French officials claimed sovereignty over staggering stretches of land, sometimes with little more than a ceremony, a wooden cross, and a flag planted on a riverbank. On European maps in Paris, indigenous homelands suddenly appeared as the domain of a distant French king. This system entangled European and indigenous rivalries tightly. The most dramatic example was the conflict between the Huron-Wendat, allied with the French, and the powerful Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, confederacy to the south. As the fur trade grew, control over hunting territories and trade routes became critical. In the mid-17th century, the Haudenosaunee launched devastating wars against the Huron, partly to seize their prime role as middlemen in the fur trade. The French, bound to the Huron by alliance, were dragged into the conflict. The results were catastrophic for the Huron. Warfare, combined with epidemics of European diseases, shattered their confederacy. Survivors were killed, adopted, or scattered. This tragedy illustrates the double-edged sword of European alliance. Indigenous nations could leverage European support for their own strategic goals, but they could also be consumed by the larger forces those Europeans unleashed. By the late 16th century, as Spain and France entrenched their claims, a third player, watching from an island kingdom, began to stir. England, once a secondary power, was changing. It was a realm simmering with religious strife, social tension, and a growing desire not to be left behind in the race for overseas riches. Its path to colonization would be hesitant, plagued by disaster, and would ultimately plant the seeds of a very different America. England in the late 1500s was an island of rising ambition and deep unease. From across the Channel, English rulers watched with envy as Spanish galleons laden with American silver funded the power of their great rival. A fear took root: if England did not secure its own foothold in the New World, it would be forever eclipsed. At the same time, the kingdom was by religious turmoil. The Protestant Reformation had taken hold, and under Queen Elizabeth I, England became firmly, defiantly Protestant. Spain, the champion of Catholicism, was both a spiritual and political enemy. This rivalry bred a strategy of piracy and planting. English sea dogs, like Sir Francis Drake, with the Queen's tacit blessing, became privateers, legalized pirates attacking Spanish treasure ships and ports. Another method was colonization, establishing permanent bases to challenge Spanish claims, support privateers, and perhaps find wealth of their own. Visionaries like Sir Walter Raleigh spun seductive dreams. They spoke of a place called Virginia, a name honoring the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth, where fertile lands, friendly natives, and perhaps even gold awaited. Colonization, they argued, would also solve domestic problems. England's growing population of poor and unemployed could be shipped across the sea, relieving pressure at home while building England's strength abroad. From these dreams emerged the first serious English attempt, Roanoke. In the 1580s, under Raleigh's direction, small groups of settlers were deposited on an island off the coast of modern North Carolina. The first group, facing hardship, simply returned home. A second group, including women and children, landed in 1587 to build a lasting community. Their governor, John White, soon sailed back to England for more supplies. His return was delayed for 3 years by war with Spain. When he finally made it back to Roanoke in 1590, he found the settlement utterly deserted. The only clue was a single word carved on a post: Croton. The fate of the lost colony remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Did they perish from disease or hunger? Did they attempt to sail elsewhere? Did they integrate with the nearby Croatan people, as the carving suggested? We may never know. But Roanoke's failure taught harsh lessons. Colonies could not be distant, underfunded adventurers left to fend for themselves. They needed sustained support, careful planning, and deeper resources. While the mystery of Roanoke faded, English interest did not die. A new financial model emerged, the joint stock company. Instead of relying on the fortune of a single patron like Raleigh, these companies pooled money from many investors. In return for shares, these investors hoped for profits if the venture succeeded. This spread the risk and made colonization feel less like a romantic gamble and more like a calculated business enterprise. The most important of these was the Virginia Company of London. Granted a charter by King James I in 1606, the company received the right to settle and govern a vast swath of North America in the king's name. Their goal was clear: find a way to make money. In late 1606, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, set sail. After a difficult, months-long voyage, about 100 men and boys entered a broad river they named the James, in honor of their king. They selected a defensible spot on a swampy peninsula and began to build a fort. They called it Jamestown. The choice of site, meant for defense against Spanish ships, was disastrous. The brackish water was undrinkable. The marshy ground bred malaria-carrying mosquitoes. The men, many of whom were gentlemen unaccustomed to hard labor, spent more time searching for imaginary gold than planting crops. The company's structure provided no clear, strong leadership on the ground. Quarrels were constant. The results were immediate and horrifying. Disease, hunger, and exposure killed most of the colonists within months. That first winter became known as the starving time. Desperation reached unspeakable levels. There is archaeological evidence of cannibalism. The colony hovered on the edge of extinction. At one point, the few survivors actually boarded ships to abandon the settlement, only to be met at the river's mouth by a new governor arriving with reinforcements and supplies. Jamestown's survival was a very near thing. One figure who imposed a grim order was Captain John Smith. His famous decree, "He that will not work shall not eat," reflected the sheer desperation. Smith also understood that their survival depended on the local indigenous power. Beyond the palisade walls stretched the domain of the Powhatan Confederacy, a network of some 30 Algonquian-speaking communities led by a paramount chief the English called Powhatan. For Powhatan, the English were a puzzle and a potential tool. They were weak and strange, but they possessed intriguing goods: copper, metal tools, glass beads. At times, Powhatan allowed food to be traded to the struggling English, perhaps seeing them as potential allies or dependent clients who could be useful in his own regional politics. At other times, relations broke down into violence and raids. The famous story of Pocahontas, Powhatan's daughter, saving John Smith's life is shrouded in legend and Smith's own self-promotion. What is clearer is that Pocahontas later became a crucial, tragic figure of connection. As a young woman, she was taken captive by the English during hostilities. She converted to Christianity, took the name Rebecca, and married the colonist John Rolfe. Her marriage ushered in a period of tense peace. She was even brought to London, presented as a symbol of successful civilization and conversion, where she died far from home. Her life embodied the immense cultural pressures and unequal power of early contact. The Virginia Company, pouring money and new settlers into this struggling outpost, demanded a return. For years, there was none, only death and pleas for more supplies. The colony needed an economic reason to exist. They would find it not in gold, but in a leaf. A strain of tobacco cultivated by John Rolfe proved perfect for European tastes. Suddenly, Virginia had a cash crop. The colony's purpose transformed overnight from desperate survival to relentless production. This shift would reshape the land, demand a new kind of labor, and set the Chesapeake region on a course that would define America for centuries to come. But what kind of society would a tobacco empire create? Tobacco changed everything. It was not merely a crop, it was a fever. John Rolfe's successful cultivation of a sweet, marketable strain provided the Virginia colony with its lifeblood, a reason for existence that London investors could finally understand: profit. The leaf created a voracious hunger for two things: land and labor. Tobacco is a greedy plant. It rapidly drains nutrients from the soil, forcing planters to constantly clear new fields. This created an irreversible outward push from the fortified safety of Jamestown. Plantations, not towns, began to define the landscape. Settlers spread out along the rivers and creeks of the Chesapeake Bay, seeking fresh, fertile ground and easy waterways to transport their hogsheads of cured leaves. This expansion was a declaration of war against the existing order. As English fences and tobacco rows spread, they encroached upon the hunting grounds, village sites, and sacred spaces of the Powhatan Confederacy and other Algonquian peoples. Temporary agreements might draw lines on a map, but the economic pressure for more land was relentless. To the colonists, unused forest was wasted space. To the indigenous nations, it was a living library of resources, a spiritual landscape, and a vital part of a seasonal cycle. These two visions of the land could not coexist. Inside the colony, the tobacco boom created a desperate cry for workers. The crop was brutally labor-intensive. Fields had to be cleared, planted, weeded, harvested, and the leaves carefully cured. A planter's ambition was limited only by the number of hands he could command. The early solution was indentured servitude. Thousands of poor English, Scottish, and Irish men and women signed contracts, or indentures, trading 4 to 7 years of labor for passage across the Atlantic and the promise of freedom dues, a small sum of money or a plot of land, at the end of their term. It was a brutal bargain. Servants faced backbreaking work, disease, and often harsh discipline. Many died before earning their freedom. But for colonial elites, the system was perfect. It provided a steady stream of labor and upheld the illusion that America was a land of opportunity, where even a servant could someday own land. To encourage the importation of this labor, Virginia established the headright system. Anyone who paid for a person's passage received 50 acres of land. Wealthy men could amass huge estates simply by financing the journeys of others. Slowly, a stark social hierarchy emerged. At the top stood a rising planter aristocracy, controlling riverfront estates and the labor of dozens. At the bottom labored the indentured servants. And in between were small farmers and former servants who had survived their terms, often finding only poor, remote land left for them. Equality was never the reality in early Virginia. Alongside English servants, there were also Africans. The first recorded Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, brought by a Dutch ship. Their initial status was ambiguous. Some were treated as servants for a term, others as lifelong slaves. For decades, the line between servitude and slavery was blurred. But as the tobacco economy grew and the supply of willing English servants fluctuated, colonial elites began to see the advantages of a labor force that was permanently bound, whose children would also be bound. Law stepped in to harden this distinction. Over the course of the 17th century, the Virginia and Maryland assemblies passed a series of statutes that codified racial slavery. They decreed that slavery was for life and hereditary, passed through the mother. They systematically stripped away the rights of Africans and their descendants, denying them the ability to bear arms, testify in court against whites, or assemble freely. Crucially, they declared that Christian baptism did not alter a person's status as property. The goal was clear: to create a permanent, racialized underclass. This legal shift coincided with growing tensions among the white population. Former servants who had earned their freedom often found the best land already claimed by the wealthy. Pushed to the dangerous frontier, They clashed with indigenous nations and felt ignored by a government in Jamestown that seemed to serve only the great planters. These tensions exploded in 1676 in an uprising known as Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy but politically marginalized planter, rallied these disaffected frontier settlers. They were angry about indigenous attacks, restrictions on expansion, and Governor William Berkeley's perceived favoritism. Bacon's followers first attacked indigenous communities, friendly and hostile alike, and then turned their fury on the colonial government itself, even burning Jamestown. The rebellion collapsed after Bacon's sudden death, but it terrified the ruling elite. They had seen how easily poor whites and former servants could unite in violence against authority. In the aftermath, Virginia's leaders consciously promoted policies to drive a wedge between poor whites and enslaved Africans. They offered small privileges to white settlers, a bit more political voice, a guarantee they would not be enslaved, while further degrading the status of black people. The strategy was to unite all whites across class lines by the shared identity of race, creating a buffer against future revolt. Thus, from the tobacco fields, a distinctive Chesapeake society was forged, a world of vast plantations, a sharp racial hierarchy, and political power concentrated in the hands of a landowning elite. It was a society built on exploitation and acutely aware of the need to control the labor upon which its wealth depended. While Virginia and later Maryland, founded as a refuge for English Catholics, developed this tobacco and slavery complex, a very different experiment was beginning far to the north. In 1620, a ship called the Mayflower made landfall on the windswept coast of a place they would call New England. The people aboard were not seeking wealth, but a refuge for their faith. They were separatists who believed the Church of England was too corrupt to reform. We remember them as the Pilgrims. Before even stepping ashore, facing the fact they were outside any established government, the adult men signed a brief, profound agreement, the Mayflower Compact. They pledged to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic and to obey laws made for the general good. It was an act of self-government rooted in their religious idea of a sacred covenant with God. Their survival that first brutal winter was made possible only by the aid of the Wampanoag people, including a remarkable man named Tisquantum, or Squanto, who spoke English and taught them how to plant corn and fish. A decade later, a much larger and better organized migration began, the Puritans. Unlike the separatist Pilgrims, Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England from within. Facing increasing persecution, they chose to build their model society an ocean away. Led by John Winthrop, who famously declared they would build a city upon a hill for the world to watch, thousands of families arrived in the 1630s, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their vision was not of individual profit, but of a godly commonwealth. Their society would be tightly knit, disciplined, and governed by their own interpretation of God's law. But what happens when conscience leads someone to disagree with the leaders of that city on a hill? The answer would tear at the fabric of their dream and scatter new colonies across the map. The Puritan city upon a hill was a vision of unity, a beacon of pure faith. But from the beginning, bright, independent minds saw God's light reflecting differently. Their dissent would stretch the boundaries of New England and test the very idea of a single, enforced truth. The first great challenge came from a young minister named Roger Williams. He arrived in Massachusetts devout and brilliant, but soon voiced beliefs that alarmed the colony's leaders. Williams argued for a wall of separation between the church and the civil government. He believed no magistrate should punish a person for their religious beliefs, a direct threat to the Puritan union of holy and secular power. Even more dangerously, he insisted the colony's charter was invalid because the king had no right to grant land that belonged to the indigenous nations. True ownership, Williams said, could only come through fair purchase from its native owners. To the authorities, this was sedition. It undermined their legal claim to the land and their God-given authority to police belief. After attempts to silence him failed, they tried and banished him in the dead of winter. Williams, ill and alone, survived only with the help of Narragansett allies. On land he purchased from them, He founded a settlement he called Providence. Here he established a radical principle: no one would be persecuted for their religion. His colony, which later joined with others to form Rhode Island, became a refuge for those who didn't fit in the Puritan mold: Baptists, Quakers, Jews. It was a noisy, messy, and profoundly important experiment in religious liberty. The second great shock to the system came from within a Boston home. And Hutchinson was a sharp-minded midwife and devout woman who began hosting weekly meetings to discuss the colony's sermons. She emphasized a doctrine of covenant of grace, arguing that true salvation came from a personal, inward experience of God's grace, not from outward obedience to laws or the approval of ministers. Her teachings, delivered by a woman to mixed gatherings of men and women, challenged both theological orthodoxy and the social order. To Governor John Winthrop and the male clergy, Hutchinson was dangerous. She was accused of antinomianism, believing moral law did not apply to the saved, and of claiming direct revelation from God. Her trial was less about doctrine and more about authority. How dare a woman instruct men? How dare she suggest one could know God without the guidance of the established ministry? Convicted and excommunicated, she too was banished. She and her followers helped settle Rhode Island and later parts of what became New York. These conflicts showed the limits of the Puritan dream of perfect unity. Their society could only be a city upon a hill by exiling those who saw a different path to the summit. Yet, the expulsions did not end dissent. They planted it in new soil, creating a more diverse colonial landscape. As Puritan leaders defended their spiritual boundaries, a more violent struggle was unfolding over physical ones: land. The early cooperation between Pilgrims and the Wampanoag at Plymouth could not withstand the constant pressure of English expansion. More ships arrived, more towns were founded, more forests were cleared for farms and pastures. For indigenous nations, each new settlement meant less land for hunting, gathering, and their own agriculture. The first major war erupted in New England in 1637, the Pequot War. The Pequot were a powerful people controlling trade in what is now Connecticut. Tensions with English settlers and their Narragansett and Mohegan allies boiled over. The war's horrific climax came at a Pequot fort on the Mystic River. English and Allied forces surrounded the palisade, set it ablaze, and shot those who tried to escape. Hundreds of Pequot men, women, and children were killed. The brutality shocked even some of the native allies. The Pequot were effectively shattered as a political force, and their lands were opened to settlement. The war set a grim pattern of extreme violence and the strategic use of interindigenous rivalries by colonists. It reinforced a Puritan belief that God was clearing the land for his chosen people. But it also sowed deeper seeds of fear and resentment among other native nations. Over the following decades, the pressure continued. A new generation grew up on both sides. Among the Wampanoag was Metacom, whom the English called King Philip. He was the son of Massasoit, the leader who had helped the Pilgrims survive. Metacom watched as his people's territory shrank through questionable land sales. His authority was undermined by English courts, and his culture was assaulted by missionaries. The breaking point came in 1675, after the English executed 3 of his men for a murder, bypassing Wampanoag justice. What followed was King Philip's War, a devastating, total conflict that swept across southern New England. Metacom forged a powerful alliance of Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett forces. They attacked over half of New England's towns, burning them to the ground. The colonists, in turn, launched brutal counterattacks, destroying native villages and food stores, and selling captives into slavery in the Caribbean. The war was catastrophic for both sides, but especially for the indigenous alliance. Metacom was killed, his body drawn and quartered, his head displayed in Plymouth for decades. The native power in southern New England was broken. For colonists, the war created a lasting siege mentality and a justification for even harsher policies of control and displacement. This city upon a hill had been defended with fire and blood, its foundations stained by the conflict it had helped create. As the 17th century waned, the English colonial world was taking shape in 3 distinct regions: the slave-based tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, the pious town-based society of New England, and a middle zone that was about to become something else entirely, a bustling, diverse crossroads where trade, not theology, was the true religion. And it would begin not with the English, but with the Dutch. While Puritans built their covenants and planters their tobacco fortunes, a different kind of colony took root in the mid-Atlantic. It was not founded on a single faith or crop, but on commerce. Its story begins not with an English charter, but with a search for a passage to the riches of Asia. In 1609, an English explorer named Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, steered his ship have Maine into a wide, deep river. He hoped it was the fabled Northwest Passage. It was not, but what he found was perhaps as valuable: a river teeming with beaver, bordered by fertile land, and inhabited by peoples eager to trade. The river would later bear his name. The Dutch, masters of global trade from their tiny republic, saw the potential. They claimed the territory, calling it New Netherland. In 1624, they established a small trading post on an island at the river's mouth. They called it New Amsterdam. Its purpose was simple: to serve as a hub for the fur trade, a place where pelts from the interior could be gathered and shipped across the Atlantic. New Netherland was, from the start, a pragmatic and plural place. The Dutch West India Company cared more about profit than religious purity. To encourage settlement, they offered generous terms, attracting not just Dutch, but also Walloons, Germans, Scandinavians, and Sephardic Jews fleeing persecution. It was one of the most ethnically diverse spots in North America. The colony's lifeblood was its relationship with the powerful indigenous confederacies of the region, particularly the Lenape along the lower river and the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, to the north. The fur trade was a partnership, if an unequal one. Dutch goods, metal tools, cloth, firearms, flowed inland. Beaver pelts flowed back to New Amsterdam. To manage this and populate the land, the Dutch established the patroon system, granting vast estates along the Hudson River to wealthy investors who could bring over settlers. These semi-feudal domains, like Rensselaerswyck, created a landscape of great landlords and tenant farmers. But this commercial colony sat like a wedge between the English settlements of New England and the Chesapeake. English kings eyed it with jealousy. In 1664, without a declaration of war, an English fleet sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam. The Dutch Director General, Peter Stuyvesant, had few defenses and little support from a weary population. He surrendered. New Netherland became New York, named for the king's brother, the Duke of York. The English takeover was surprisingly smooth. They promised to respect property rights and religious tolerance. Dutch families stayed, their language and customs lingering for generations. But now, the colony was part of England's grand imperial design. South of New York, the Duke of York granted lands to proprietors who founded New Jersey. And to the west, an even more ambitious experiment began. In 1681, King Charles II granted a massive tract of land to William Penn to settle a debt owed to Penn's father. Penn was a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends, whose beliefs in peace, equality, and an inner light of God in every person had brought them brutal persecution in England. Penn saw his grant as a holy experiment. He planned a colony based on religious freedom, fair dealings with indigenous peoples, and a humane legal system. He personally oversaw the layout of its capital, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, with wide streets and public squares. He negotiated a series of treaties with the Lenape, famously under a great elm tree at Shakamaxon, seeking to acquire land through purchase rather than conquest. While the reality would later be marred by pressure and broken promises, Penn's initial intent created a period of remarkable peace. Pennsylvania prospered quickly. Its fertile soil made it a breadbasket, producing wheat and rye for export. Penn's promise of religious tolerance and cheap land drew a flood of immigrants, not just English Quakers, but German Pietists, Mennonites, Amish, Lutherans, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and more. Philadelphia grew into a bustling port, a center of printing and intellectual life. By the early 18th century, the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania had become the dynamic heart of English America. They were defined by mixed economies of grain, trade, and craft, by ethnic and religious diversity, and by a political culture that balanced royal authority with assertive colonial assemblies. Here, the focus was on getting ahead in this world, not solely preparing for the next. This growing colonial world was increasingly tied together by the sea. Ships carried fish from New England, grain from the Middle Colonies, and tobacco from the Chesapeake to ports across the Atlantic. But one trade route was darker and more terrible than all others. It did not carry goods, but human beings. It was the Middle Passage, and it was forging a brutal new system in the southern colonies that would come to define an entire region and stain the nation's birth. For in the Carolinas and the Caribbean, a different model had taken root with terrifying efficiency. Colonists from the overcrowded, sugar-rich island of Barbados brought with them a blueprint, the plantation. Not the smaller tobacco farms of Virginia, but vast, factory-like operations dedicated to a single, labor-intensive cash crop worked by enslaved Africans. In the swampy lowcountry of Carolina, that crop was rice. The cultivation of rice in the tidal marshes was brutal, deadly work. It required enslaved laborers to stand in knee-deep water under a blazing sun, battling mosquitoes and disease. The death rates were horrifyingly high, but the profits were immense. To work this system, planters demanded a labor force that was permanent, hereditary, and racially defined. The legal codes of slavery, honed in Barbados, were adopted and hardened. Thus, as the 18th century dawned, a stark contrast was etched across the colonial map. In the north, societies of towns, trades, and diverse faiths. In the middle, bustling ports and fertile farms. And in the south, an oligarchy of planters whose staggering wealth rested on the foundation of race-based, chattel slavery. All of them, however, were about to be drawn into the vortex of a final, great conflict between empires, a war that would redraw the map of the continent and, unexpectedly, set the colonies on a collision course with the mother country itself. By the middle of the 18th century, the British colonies had matured. They were no longer fragile outposts, but thriving, complex societies with their own economies, governments, and growing sense of identity. Yet their world was not secure. To the north and west loomed the vast domain of New France, a sprawling network of forts, fur traders, and indigenous alliances stretching from the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi. The stage was set for a final, epic clash between the two empires, a struggle that would echo in the forests of America and decide the fate of a continent. The fuse was lit in a lush, contested valley, the Ohio country. This was coveted land. For Virginian land speculators and westward-looking colonists, it promised expansion and fortune. For the French, it was the vital link connecting Canada to their settlements in Louisiana. For the diverse Native American nations living there, Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, it was their homeland, a prize in a delicate game of balance between the European powers. In the early 1750s, the French moved to secure their claim, building a chain of forts in the region. To the British, this was an aggressive blockade. In 1754, the governor of Virginia sent a young, ambitious militia colonel named George Washington to deliver an ultimatum. The French politely refused. Tensions escalated into a skirmish where Washington's men fired the first shots of a global war, killing a French officer. Retreating, Washington hastily built a poor defensive position he called Fort Necessity. He was soon surrounded and forced to surrender, an inauspicious start for the future commander-in-chief. The war, which would erupt into the global 7 Years' War, began disastrously for the British. In 1755, a pompous General Edward Braddock marched a column of redcoats into the Pennsylvania wilderness to seize the key French Fort Duquesne. He ignored warnings about frontier warfare. In a devastating ambush near the Monongahela River, French and Indian forces decimated his army. Braddock was killed, and a young Washington helped lead the bloody retreat. The message was clear: European tactics were useless in the American woods. For the next several years, the French and their indigenous allies seemed to hold the advantage, launching raids on the vulnerable frontier settlements. panic spread through the colonies. In 1754, facing this common threat, representatives from 7 colonies had met in Albany, New York. There, Benjamin Franklin proposed a plan of union for a coordinated colonial government for defense. It was a visionary idea, but it was rejected by every colonial assembly who feared losing their power, and by the British Crown, who feared a united colonial entity. The seeds of unity, however, had been planted. The tide of war turned when Britain's energetic Prime Minister, William Pitt, decided to invest massively in the North American theater. He sent fresh troops and, crucially, promised to reimburse the colonies for their military expenses, which galvanized colonial support. British strategy also adapted, learning to use light infantry and ranger tactics. One by one, French strongholds fell. The pivotal moment came in 1759 at the cliffs of Quebec. In a daring night maneuver, British General James Wolfe led his men up a narrow path to the Plains of Abraham, a plateau outside the fortress city. The ensuing battle was short and decisive. Both Wolfe and the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, were mortally wounded, becoming tragic heroes in their nation's lore. The fall of Quebec broke the backbone of New France. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded almost all its mainland North American territory to Britain. From London, it looked like a magnificent triumph. The French menace was removed. Britain stood as the undisputed master of Eastern North America. Colonial volunteers toasted their shared victory with the mother country. But beneath the celebration, the war had planted the seeds of a future rupture in 3 critical ways. First was the staggering cost. The British national debt had doubled. The government in London believed it was only fair that the colonies, now secure and prosperous, should help pay for the war fought to protect them. New taxes were inevitable. Second was the problem of the vast new territory. The Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving that land for Native Americans. The intent was to prevent costly frontier wars and manage expansion orderly. To land-hungry colonists and speculators, it felt like a betrayal. Had they not fought and bled for that very land? Third, and perhaps most profound, was the change in perception. The war had allowed colonists from different regions to fight side by side, fostering a new American identity. They had also witnessed British regulars in action and saw they were not invincible. Colonial militia had proven their worth. The confidence born of this experience would not easily be forgotten. The first test of the new imperial order came swiftly. Needing revenue, Parliament passed the Sugar Act in 1764, tightening enforcement of duties on molasses and taxing other goods. Colonists grumbled, but it was the Stamp Act of 1765 that truly ignited a firestorm. This law required a tax stamp on all printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. It was an internal tax, levied directly on the colonists' daily lives by a parliament in which they had no elected representation. The cry went up, "No taxation without representation." Colonial assemblies passed defiant resolutions. In port cities, secret societies like the Sons of Liberty organized. Mobs harassed stamp distributors, forcing them to resign. A coordinated boycott of British goods began to bite. Most significantly, 9 colonies sent delegates to a Stamp Act Congress in New York, the first significant intercolonial gathering since the Albany Congress. They petitioned the king and parliament, asserting their rights as Englishmen. Faced with this united resistance and pressure from British merchants hurt by the boycott, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Colonial towns erupted in celebration. But in that same moment, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear: we retreated on this tax, but our power is supreme. The calm was fragile. In 1767, a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, imposed a fresh set of duties on imports like glass, lead, paint, and tea. The Townshend Acts also created a new American Board of Customs Commissioners, headquartered in Boston, to crack down on smuggling. Colonists saw this as another end run around their rights. The boycotts began again, now with wider participation. A new phrase entered the political discourse: non-importation. In Boston, enforcement of the hated customs laws led to heightened tensions. The presence of British troops, sent to protect the officials, became a constant irritant. On a cold March night in 1770, a confrontation between a mob and a squad of nervous redcoats escalated. Stones and insults flew. In the chaos, the soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 men. Patriots labeled it the Boston Massacre. Though the soldiers were later defended in court by a young lawyer named John Adams, the event became a potent symbol of British tyranny. Parliament, again swayed by economic pressure, repealed most of the Townshend duties in 1770, keeping only the tax on tea as a symbol of its authority. A tense quiet settled over the colonies for the next 3 years. But the tea tax remained a tiny, stubborn thread. And when Britain pulled on it in 1773, the entire fabric of empire would begin to unravel. The next act would play out not in legislative halls, but in a rebellious city's icy harbor. The quiet that followed the Boston Massacre was deceptive, a shallow calm over deep water. In the colonies, committees of correspondence, networks of letter writing between towns and provinces, kept the embers of dissent alive, sharing news and shaping a common narrative of endangered liberty. In London, the government still believed in its right to govern and tax its distant possessions. That belief was about to trigger a crisis over a seemingly simple commodity: tea. The British East India Company, a colossal trading enterprise, was in trouble. Swamped with debt and sitting on mountains of unsold tea, it appealed to Parliament for a bailout. The solution was the Tea Act of 1773. The law gave the company a monopoly on selling tea in America and allowed it to ship directly to colonial agents, bypassing middlemen. This made the company's tea, even with the Townshend duty still attached, cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea. British officials thought they were clever. They assumed colonists, ever practical, would choose the cheaper tea and quietly accept the principle of parliamentary taxation. They could not have been more wrong. For colonial leaders, the issue was never the price, but the precedent. To buy the taxed tea was to surrender their argument against taxation without representation. Furthermore, the monopoly threatened to put countless colonial merchants and smugglers out of business. Resistance was swift and coordinated. In Philadelphia and New York, mass pressure forced the company's consignees to resign. Ships were turned back. But in Boston, the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined to stand firm. He refused to let the tea ships leave the harbor without paying the duty. According to law, the cargo had to be unloaded and the duty paid within 20 days, or customs officials could seize it. As the deadline of December 16, 1773, approached, thousands of Bostonians packed into the Old South Meeting House. Debate raged. Finally, as night fell, a signal was given. A group of men, loosely disguised as Mohawk warriors, moved quietly to Griffin's Wharf. With disciplined efficiency, they boarded the 3 ships, hauled 342 chests of tea onto the decks, split them open with axes, and dumped the entire fortune, worth millions in today's currency, into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was an act of deliberate political destruction. When news reached London, the reaction was one of unified outrage. Even friends of the colonies saw it as wanton vandalism. Parliament, now led by the inflexible Lord North, decided Massachusetts must be punished severely and made an example. In 1774, they passed a series of laws colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor to all trade until the destroyed tea was paid for, starving the city's economy. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter, giving the royal governor sweeping powers and curbing democratic town meetings. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, far from colonial juries. The Quartering Act authorized the housing of British soldiers in private homes. A fifth law, the Quebec Act, extended that province's boundaries into the Ohio Valley and guaranteed toleration for French Catholics. which many Protestants saw as a threatening alliance of popery and tyranny. The British strategy was to isolate radical Boston and force it to submit. The effect was the opposite. The punishment was so harsh it sparked a wave of sympathy and fear throughout the colonies. If Parliament could dismantle Massachusetts' government, what charter was safe? Food and supplies poured into Boston from other colonies. The call went out for a General Congress to coordinate a united response. In September 1774, 56 delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia did not attend, gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. It was an extraordinary moment. Virginia planters like Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee sat alongside Massachusetts lawyers like John Adams and Pennsylvania moderates like John Dickinson. They were not revolutionaries yet. Most still hoped for reconciliation within the British Empire. After intense debate, the Congress took several bold steps. They adopted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting the colonists' entitlement to all the rights of Englishmen, including the key principle that only their own elected assemblies could tax them. They created the Continental Association, a sweeping agreement to suspend all trade with Britain until the intolerable acts were repealed. Most importantly, they agreed to meet again in May 1775 if their demands were not met. They had drawn a line in the sand. Back in Massachusetts, the atmosphere was electric and tense. A shadow government, the Provincial Congress, began to collect arms and organize militia. Special companies of Minutemen trained, ready to assemble at a moment's warning. General Thomas Gage, the British military commander and royal governor, found his authority shrinking to the city of Boston itself. In April 1775, he received orders from London to seize the rebels' military supplies and arrest their ringleaders. Gage planned a secret night mission to capture a reported cache of arms in the town of Concord, about 20 miles inland. But in a city thick with spies, secrecy was impossible. Patriots like Paul Revere and William Dawes had networks ready. On the night of April 18th, when British troops began to row across the Charles River, signal lanterns flashed from the old North Church steeple, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Revere, Dawes, and others set out on frantic midnight rides, rousing the countryside. "The regulars are out," was the cry. Just after dawn on April 19th, a column of about 700 redcoats reached the village of Lexington. On the green stood a thin line of about 70 Minutemen, under Captain John Parker. No one knows who fired the shot heard round the world. A volley rang out from the British lines. 8 Minutemen were killed, 10 wounded. The British column marched on, their mission compromised. At Concord, they found few supplies, most having been hidden. After a skirmish at the North Bridge, where Colonial militia fired in unison for the first time, forcing the British to retreat, the long march back to Boston began. It turned into a nightmare. Militia swarmed from every hill, fence line, and woodlet, firing from cover. By the time the bloodied column reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered 273 casualties. The colonists had lost 95. The war had begun. News of Lexington and Concord flew along the Colonial post roads. Militia from across New England streamed toward Boston, trapping Gage's army on the peninsula. A ragtag army of some 15,000 men laid siege to the city. The Second Continental Congress, convening in Philadelphia in May 1775, now faced an irrevocable fact of war. They had to govern the rebellion. Their first momentous act was to adopt the New England militia as the Continental Army. And for its commander-in-chief, they unanimously chose the tall, dignified Virginian whose experience and bearing seemed to embody their cause, George Washington. As Washington traveled north to take command, another battle erupted. On June 17th, the British attacked colonial positions on Breed's Hill, near Boston. The battle would be misnamed for nearby Bunker Hill. The result was a Pyrrhic British victory. The colonists held their ground through 2 bloody assaults, only retreating when their ammunition ran out. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," became legend. The British took the ground, but at a catastrophic cost of over 1,000 casualties. The message was seared into the minds of both sides. This would not be a short or easy war. The colonies were now in open, armed rebellion. But for what? To restore their rights as Englishmen, or to seek something entirely new? The answer would be written in the summer of 1776, in a document that would turn a colonial uprising into a world-changing revolution. The siege of Boston settled into a grim stalemate through the end of 1775. George Washington faced the monumental task of transforming a collection of enthusiastic but undisciplined militia companies into a professional army. They lacked everything: gunpowder, uniforms, pay, and a navy to challenge British control of the harbor. Yet the spirit of defiance held them together. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress wrestled with the profound question of their purpose. Were they rebels seeking redress and restoration of their rights within the British Empire, or were they something more? Many delegates, especially from the middle colonies, still hoped for reconciliation. In July 1775, they sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, a final appeal professing loyalty and begging him to intervene before the rift became irreparable. Simultaneously, they issued a declaration explaining the causes for taking up arms, a contradictory stance that reflected their deep uncertainty. The king's response was unequivocal. He refused to even receive the Olive Branch Petition. In August 1775, he issued a proclamation declaring the colonies to be in a state of open and avowed rebellion. He authorized the hiring of German mercenaries, Hessians, to help crush the revolt. The door to reconciliation was slammed shut and bolted from London's side. Over the winter, a pivotal event shifted the military balance. A young bookseller and artillery colonel named Henry Knox, on Washington's orders, orchestrated an astonishing feat. He and his men hauled 60 tons of captured cannon over 300 miles of frozen wilderness from Fort Ticonderoga in New York to the hills overlooking Boston. In March 1776, Washington placed these guns on Dorchester Heights, threatening the British fleet in the harbor. Faced with this untenable position, General William Howe, who had replaced Gage, chose to evacuate. On March 17th, British troops and over 1,000 Loyalist civilians sailed for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Boston was free. The first major victory, however symbolic, belonged to the Continentals. The war's focus now shifted to the middle colonies, particularly New York City, which British strategists saw as the key to dividing the rebellious colonies. As a massive British armada gathered off Staten Island in the summer of 1776, a political earthquake was occurring in Philadelphia. The question of independence, once a radical whisper, was now a roaring public debate. Fueling this shift was a powerful, plain-spoken pamphlet published in January 1776. Common Sense, by the recently arrived English immigrant Thomas Paine, became a sensation. Rejecting the careful legal arguments of the past, Paine attacked the very idea of monarchy and hereditary rule. A king, he wrote, is no more than a brute who has made himself king by butchering other brutes. He argued it was simple common sense for a vast continent to be ruled by a distant, tiny island. His call for a new, independent American republic, based on the consent of the governed, electrified ordinary people. It transformed the argument from a dispute over taxes into a struggle for a new kind of society. Momentum in the Congress swung toward the radicals. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A committee was appointed to draft a formal declaration. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. The task of writing fell principally to the 33-year-old Jefferson. In a rented room on Market Street in Philadelphia, Jefferson composed one of the most revolutionary documents in human history. He wove together Enlightenment philosophy, a list of grievances against King George III, and a bold assertion of universal principle. The immortal preamble declared that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. When a government destroys these ends, The people have a right to alter or abolish it. After debate and some editing, including the painful removal of a clause condemning the slave trade, the Congress voted on Lee's resolution for independence on July 2, 1776. The second day of July, 1776, John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, will be the most memorable epic in the history of America, celebrated by succeeding generations as the Great Anniversary Festival. He was off by 2 days. On July 4th, the Congress formally adopted the edited Declaration of Independence. The world had changed. 13 colonies were now 13 sovereign states, united in a cause. The news spread slowly but ignited celebrations, bonfires, and the toppling of royal statues. In New York, on July 9th, Washington had the declaration read aloud to his assembled troops. That evening, a jubilant crowd and soldiers pulled down a massive gilded lead statue of King George III on horseback. The metal would later be melted down from musket balls, symbolism made brutally literal. But the euphoria of independence was immediately tempered by the harsh reality of war. Just days later, the British hammer fell on New York. General Howe's force of over 30,000 professional soldiers and Hessians, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled, landed on Staten Island, then moved to crush Washington's outnumbered, outgunned army. The Battle of Long Island in August was a disaster for the Americans. Only a miraculous, fog-shrouded nighttime evacuation across the East River saved the Continental Army from total capture. What followed was a desperate, fighting retreat across New York and New Jersey. Washington's army dwindled through desertion and defeat. By December 1776, it was a frozen, demoralized shadow, huddled on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. The British, believing the rebellion was finished, settled into winter quarters. The cause of American independence, not 6 months old, seemed poised to expire in the snow. It was in this darkest hour that Washington gambled everything on a single, desperate stroke. On Christmas night, 1776, through a fierce sleet storm, he led 2,400 shivering men back across the ice-choked Delaware River. Marching 9 miles through the night, they surprised and captured a garrison of Hessians at Trenton, New Jersey. A week later, he struck again at Princeton. These were small victories in military terms, but their psychological impact was colossal. They proved the Continental Army could strike back. They revived hope. The flame of revolution, though flickering, was not snuffed out. The long, hard war for the meaning of that July declaration was just beginning. Could a band of rebels truly defeat the greatest empire on earth? The answer would be written over 5 more years of perseverance, heartbreak, and an unlikely alliance with an old enemy. The desperate victories at Trenton and Princeton bought the Revolution a winter's breath, but the spring of 1777 brought renewed British ambition. Their strategy was to split the rebellious colonies in two. A large force under General John Burgoyne would drive south from Canada down the Lake Champlain-Hudson River corridor, aiming to link up with General Howe's army coming north from New York City. If successful, New England, the heart of the rebellion, would be severed and strangled. But the plan unraveled. General Howe, instead of moving north, decided to capture the rebel capital of Philadelphia. He succeeded in taking the city in September 1777 after defeating Washington at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. The Continental Congress fled, and Washington's army endured the bitter winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a name synonymous with suffering, starvation, and endurance. Yet, while Howe occupied Philadelphia, Burgoyne's army floundered in the northern wilderness. Burgoyne's progress was slow, hampered by felled trees and constant harassment. More crucially, he failed to gain the expected support from loyalists, and his indigenous allies grew wary. American militia, known as the Green Mountain Boys, swarmed around his forces. In a series of sharp engagements, notably at Bennington and Freeman's Farm, Burgoyne's army was bled dry. By October, he was trapped near Saratoga, New York, outnumbered and surrounded. On October 17, 1777, General Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. The victory at Saratoga was the turning point of the war. It proved the Continental Army could win a major, conventional battle. Most importantly, it convinced a skeptical world that the American cause had a real chance. 4 months, American diplomats in Paris, led by Benjamin Franklin, had been courting France, Britain's ancient enemy. The news from Saratoga was the final argument. In February 1778, France formally recognized the United States and signed treaties of alliance and commerce. The rebellion was now a global war. French entry changed everything. It provided the Americans with what they desperately lacked: a powerful navy, professional soldiers, loans, and supplies. The British, now facing a world war, had to divert resources to defend their Caribbean islands and other global holdings. The war in America became a grinding stalemate, shifting to the southern colonies where Britain believed loyalist support was stronger. The Southern Campaign, beginning in late 1778, was brutal and bloody. Savannah and Charleston fell to the British. American armies suffered devastating defeats at Camden and Waxhaws. But British and Loyalist forces, through harsh tactics, alienated the very population they sought to win over. The war in the South descended into a savage civil war of neighbor against neighbor, with brutal partisan fighters like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harrying British supply lines. Through the gloom, an American army emerged in the South, rebuilt by the tactical genius of General Nathanael Greene. Greene understood he did not need to win battles to win the campaign. He just needed to wear the enemy down. He led the British on an exhausting chase across the Carolinas. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, Greene inflicted such heavy casualties on the British that their commander, Lord Cornwallis, was forced to abandon the Carolinas and march his battered army north into Virginia to seek supplies and reinforcements. Cornwallis established a base at the small port of Yorktown on the Virginia Peninsula, expecting the Royal Navy to keep him supplied and mobile. It was a fatal miscalculation. Washington, seeing the opportunity, executed a masterful deception. He made it appear he was preparing to attack New York, then rapidly marched his combined American and French forces south. At the same time, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed from the Caribbean and defeated a British relief fleet, gaining control of the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis was trapped, by land by Washington and the French general Rochambeau, and by sea by de Grasse. The siege of Yorktown began in late September 1781. For weeks, Allied artillery pounded the British defenses. On October 14th, American and French troops captured 2 key British redoubts in a daring night assault. With his position crumbling and no hope of rescue, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. As his army marched out to lay down their arms, their band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was an apt description. The defeat at Yorktown broke Britain's political will to continue the fight. Although some fighting sputtered on, peace negotiations began in Paris in 1782. The American delegation, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, skillfully negotiated a remarkably favorable treaty, playing the European powers against each other. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, formally ended the war. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, with boundaries stretching west to the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes, and south to Spanish Florida. It was a territorial bonanza few could have imagined in 1776. The guns fell silent. The long, Revolutionary War was over. The colonial era, which began with Norse longships and indigenous nations, and unfolded through centuries of struggle, adaptation, and conflict, had reached its dramatic, improbable conclusion. A new nation now existed where 13 colonies once stood. But what had been created? A loose confederation of squabbling states, exhausted and in debt, facing the monumental task of inventing a nation from the wreckage of war and the lofty ideals of a declaration. The story of colonial America was finished. The daunting, uncertain, and thrilling story of the United States was about to begin. The last British soldiers boarded their transports in New York Harbor in November 1783. A strange quiet settled over the seaports and battlefields. The war was won, but the peace felt fragile, like thin ice over a deep pond. The United States was independent, yet it was not unified. It was a collection of 13 sovereign states, bound by a wartime agreement called the Articles of Confederation that created a central government with the strength of a whispered suggestion. It could not tax, regulate trade, or enforce its own laws. The challenges were staggering. The national debt was massive, owed to foreign bankers and to its own soldiers who had been paid in nearly worthless paper. British troops still occupied forts in the Great Lakes region, and Spain controlled the Mississippi River mouth, threatening western expansion. The states bickered over borders and tariffs, acting more like jealous siblings than united partners. To many in Europe, the American experiment looked like it might collapse under the weight of its own freedom. Yet, within this crisis, the ideas forged in the colonial era began to reshape themselves into a new national blueprint. The colonial experience had been a long lesson in self-government, from the Mayflower Compact to the Virginia House of Burgesses to the Defiant Stamp Act Congress. It had also been a lesson in the dangers of distant, unaccountable power. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 for a constitutional convention were the products of that world. They were planters, lawyers, and merchants who had lived through the Revolution. They feared chaos, but they also feared tyranny. For 4 months, behind locked and guarded doors, they argued, compromised, and invented. The document they crafted, the United States Constitution, was a machine of balanced power, designed to prevent the concentration of authority they despised in kings and parliaments. It created a strong federal government with the power to tax and regulate commerce, but divided that power among 3 branches: executive, legislative, judicial, each able to check the others. It was a radical application of Enlightenment reason to the messy reality of governance. But it was also a document of its time, stained by the original sin of the colonial economy. To secure the support of Southern states, compromises were made that protected the institution of slavery, counting enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for political representation and guaranteeing the continuation of the transatlantic slave trade for at least 20 more years. The ideals of liberty proclaimed in 1776 remained tragically, violently incomplete. The fight for ratification was fierce. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, argued passionately in a series of essays, the Federalist Papers, that a strong union was the only guarantee of survival and prosperity. The Anti-Federalists feared a new, distant power that could become as oppressive as the British Crown. They demanded a specific list of protected individual liberties. To secure victory, the Federalists promised such a list would be the first order of business for the new government. This promise gave birth to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, enshrining freedoms of speech, religion, press, and assembly that were direct reflexes from colonial grievances over stamped paper and quartered soldiers. In 1789, the new government was launched. George Washington, the Virginia planter who had commanded the army, was unanimously elected the first president. His every action set a precedent. He consciously stepped down after 2 terms, rejecting the lure of power, establishing a tradition of peaceful transfer that would become the bedrock of the Republic. The young nation now turned its eyes westward, to the vast continent its treaty had claimed. That land, of course, was not empty. It was the home of powerful indigenous confederacies who had not been party to the Paris negotiations. The story of colonial expansion, the push for land, the clash of cultures, the broken treaties, would become the central, tragic drama of the new nation's first century. This city upon a hill now cast a long, and often dark, shadow across the continent. And so, the long thread that began with ancient mound builders and Norse explorers, that wound through the tobacco fields of Jamestown, the meeting houses of Plymouth, the diverse ports of New Amsterdam and Philadelphia, and the battlefields of Lexington and Yorktown, was woven into a new pattern. The colonies were gone. In their place stood a fragile, hopeful, deeply flawed republic, tasked with the impossible work of living up to its own founding words, that all men are created equal. It is a story that echoes in our sleep, in the deep places where memory and myth reside. A story of first footsteps on a frozen shore, of seeds planted in unfamiliar earth, of covenants made and broken, of a shot in a morning mist that changed everything. It is a story not of simple origins, but of a tangled, difficult, and relentless becoming.